Hello and welcome to Face to Face with me, Daisy Anwar, a program that brings the world to your screen and where we meet people who make a difference to our lives. And you could also follow this program live on 105.8 Light FM Radio, Jakarta. In this episode, we address an issue that is of global concern, which is climate change. In the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, known as COP15 last year, the world agreed that green growth and reducing carbon emission is vital for the future and sustainability of the planet. The conference, however, failed to come up with a binding agreement that would provide a detailed roadmap on how to make reduction emission in developed countries implementable and with clear targets. It is to be hoped that the next UN Climate Change Conference, COP16 in Cancun, Mexico, the developed countries in particular would show better commitment so that the conference would finally produce a global agreement that could be properly implemented. I talked to the president of COP16 and Mexican Foreign Affairs Minister Patricia Espinosa on how preparations for the next climate change conference in December are coming along during her visit to Jakarta, here on Face to Face with Daisy Anwar. In December 2009, 45,000 people traveled to the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen. With 110 world leaders attending, it was a rare thing to have an international conference on that scale, just focusing on one topic: climate change. The 15th Conference of the Parties, or COP15 meeting in Copenhagen, was the culmination of months of negotiations aimed at promoting urgent decision-making and action to combat climate change based on an action plan drawn up in Bali 2 years earlier. Most of those who attended the UN summit were convinced that a global agreement on climate change needed to be reached. After all, climate change affects every country, making it everybody's business. And for world leaders, it was a central issue to address. However, after tough negotiations fraught with emotions, the summit failed to deliver a climate deal that all parties agreed to. Instead, it resulted in an accord drawn up by 5 countries, led by the United States, that was far from satisfactory or significant in view of the urgency of the matter. No clear target was laid out. So, what went wrong? It seemed there was a lot of talk, but very few people listening. At the end of the day, it appears that when it comes to combating climate change, big countries such as the United States, Brazil, China and India prefer to negotiate outside a framework that is not global and legally binding, not with set targets, but in which they could put forward their own interests first. The Climate Change Summit had 3 big tickets on its agenda: emissions, financial assistance and the process going ahead. And on each of these counts, the accord fell woefully short. For example, there's no quantified aggregate target for emissions reductions, such as the 50% by 2050 that was in early drafts. The Copenhagen Accord was viewed as a hastily hashed backroom deal by some countries that spelled out intentions and yet without any clear detail or roadmap on how they are to be implemented. As such, it was an anticlimax to all parties. The question is, what is next after Copenhagen? Only 2 years before the Copenhagen summit in COP13 in Bali, many world leaders agree that Copenhagen would be the summit to reduce carbon emissions, and many had hoped that there would be a global agreement that is legally binding and adhered to by all countries. However, with its less than happy results, it is hoped that preparations for COP16 in Cancun would extract commitments from developed countries, particularly the United States, to come up with a clear target and strategy to reduce carbon emissions, and not just vague words. Mexico, the host of the next COP, would need to work hard to ensure a better outcome than the one in Denmark last year. When the president of the COP16 and Mexico's foreign minister made a visit to Jakarta a while back, it was a good opportunity for me to ask her about what she's doing to prepare for the upcoming UN Climate Change Summit in Cancun next December. Mexico is the host of the COP16, and what sort of preparations is Mexico doing in order to make it a success, especially, I imagine, with so much burden of expectations on Mexico?
We are working on many fields. On the one hand, I would underline the importance of the work we have been doing in restoring confidence and trust among the different parties that are participating in the negotiations. We have, in that sense, been very eager to engage in dialogue and contacts with countries from all different regions of the world, and to making sure that everybody is confident that the process of negotiation will be transparent, will take place within the designated working groups that have emerged from the convention and that were their mandates were extended during the conference at Copenhagen. And yes, at the same time, undertaking consultations, informal consultations that cannot be seen, and this is something that we have underlined. They are not negotiations on the margins. The negotiations only take place within the working groups, but the consultations can feed in a lot of inputs for those negotiations.
How do you measure the level of confidence at the moment?
Within the working groups, we have been able to get to an agreement in order to allow the chairs of the working groups to produce text to facilitate the negotiations, which is something that had not happened before. And in such a complex issue, you really need to be able to have some ways of concentrating on the specifics that can be part of an eventual outcome. So this is one particular point that I think shows this degree of confidence by the member states.
And you yourself will be the president of COP16. How do you feel about carrying so much burden of expectation?
Well, it is a great responsibility. No doubt it is really a very, very big responsibility. And let me say that the reason why our president has taken the decision to ask the foreign ministry and me personally to undertake this huge task has to do with the fact that he recognizes that the process of negotiation, although for sure has a lot of technical contents, it requires political decisions, and it has to be seen as a process of political negotiation in order to be able to have the ability to put everybody's interests and minds together.
Okay, let me focus more on the substance. And you have this special climate change program that Mexico has mapped out. Now, tell me a little bit about that, and how do you think that would add to making the COP16 a success?
Well, actually, the special program on climate change for Mexico that President Calderón has launched really reflects the conviction that he has in his leadership regarding the need to make a very consistent effort in order to fight climate change. Mexico is one country that is also very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We have seen it in the last years. For instance, right now there is a lot of floodings and devastation in some areas in the northern part of Mexico as a result of one of the Hurricane Alex that came into Mexico just a few days ago.
Funding commitments made in Copenhagen, I think, if I'm not mistaken, $30 billion funding for mitigation and adaptation, for example. But how do you think these funds could be used best? The United States, plus a few other countries and many large corporations, have been against climate change treaties due to the fear of the threat to their economy and profits if they have to make substantial changes. It is seen in the Copenhagen Accord, which was seen as a failure between developed and developing countries to negotiate. It reflects the fact that many countries only want to be answerable to themselves. They will cooperate, but not under the threat of legal sanction. It is hoped that Cancun would yield more positive outcome for the sake of the planet. How do you yourself view COP15 and where did it go wrong?
Well, we think there were some areas of important progress made at COP15 in Copenhagen, in particular the area of financing, where the developed countries did commit to provide funds for the short term and for the long term, and put numbers to those commitments, which is the first time that ever had happened. On the other side, we also had a broad range of commitments on the side of developing countries regarding efforts in the area of mitigation and adaptation. That is something also that had not happened before. So I think there were these results that cannot be seen as minor. But at the same time, unfortunately, there was an atmosphere of mistrust because in some part of the consultations, not everybody was included, and that created a lot of lack of confidence and of a spirit of solidarity.
And there was no real consensus, no real written agreement on targets other than the funding, for example.
Yes, well, there was an expectation, because, especially because of the presence of so many heads of state and government, that really a groundbreaking agreement could be reached, and this was not the case.
Do you think this will be reached in Mexico, some kind of concrete agreement, at least, not a setback to what happened last year in Copenhagen?
Definitely. We are quite confident that we can arrive to a very substantive agreement that takes us forward and that allows countries to put in action specific measures that bring us closer to the goal of avoiding the increasing warming up of the atmosphere.
Okay, you mentioned something about the funding commitments made in Copenhagen. I think, if I'm not mistaken, $30 billion funding for mitigation and adaptation, for example. But how do you think these funds could be used best? And do you think the funds could be implemented correctly?
Well, so far we have seen there are already announcements for around $28 billion of those $30 billion that are what are called the Fast Start funds for the first 3 years until 2012. And they are directed to various different areas of actions. And it depends a lot on what kind of projects and needs the specific developing countries are presenting. We don't have now any entity or anybody that is mandated to give a follow-up to that, to the implementation of those Fast Start funds. And this is something that we have been discussing, and we're trying to set up some kind of web page where all the commitments and the actual disbursement of funds can be registered to give visibility and also transparency to this process.
And now one of the key things is to getting consensus, and anything under the UN, obviously it involves a lot of countries, a lot of interest, and it's very difficult to get people to agree on common grounds. And the US, as the biggest emitter, and China also, which is catching up as the biggest emitter, seen as sort of maybe stumbling blocks, but they could also be the key to making this COP16 a success. How would you see them? What sort of role would they play in the COP16? What do you hope them to contribute?
Yes, definitely they do play a major role, and for that reason we have also engaged into active consultations with them both, and also with India and other big emerging countries that also have to undertake important efforts in order to commit really to this agenda. And on the side of the U.S., we see from the part of President Obama that there is a willingness to make as much use as possible of its powers within the executive branch to be able to go to aim for more ambitious commitments in terms of mitigation, which is already a big step forward from what we have seen before.
But what are you expecting from the U.S. to bring to the table?
Well, we're expecting them to confirm their commitments regarding financing, regarding also the provision of technology to developing countries, and we are expecting them also to provide ambitious goals in terms of mitigation of their own national emissions. And in the case of China, we would expect that China could maintain, because at the end China also signed up to the Copenhagen Agreement, maintain the offer they have made in the context of the Copenhagen Agreement to undertake some specific actions also in the area of mitigation and adaptation. And they are doing so. I mean,
and you're optimistic that there will be some kind of global consensus at the end of COP16, basically where everybody agrees to put their interest aside and look after the planet, so it were.
We think it is possible, and we are doing and putting into this task absolutely all our capacities and all our efforts.
Well, perhaps some people are sort of cynical when it comes to anything which is global consensus. It's because of the different interests, because of just the different needs that each country has. Do you think that this COP is becoming sort of politicized as we go along, and the interest in talking about climate change is actually lessening now than, say, a couple of years ago?
Well, I think all of these processes in the multilateral area are political processes, because they are about governments taking political decisions regarding specific problems that need to be addressed. In the case of climate change, I really don't think that the momentum will be lost, because we are looking at the effects of climate change. We are suffering the effects of climate change every day. Just today there was this incredible rain here in Jakarta,
yes.
And I was told this is not the time for the rainy season. So it's very evident.
And strange heat waves, you know.
Yes, it's very evident, and it implies not only the fact of having floods, but it implies the loss of human lives. It implies a lot of also material and financial damages. So it's really an issue that needs to be addressed.
Indonesia is already a significant emitter of greenhouse gases due to deforestation and land use change. What is Mexico herself doing in order to reduce greenhouse gases emissions? Any development of clean energy?
Yes. One area of very effective action has been a program on reforestation that is actually a program for the payment of environmental services. We have been inspired also by the experience of Indonesia, and in a very short time we are getting significant results, and it has turned out to be one instrument also to fight poverty, because not only the people are being paid to plant the trees, but also to take care of the trees and to see that they grow. So they are getting an income from taking care of the trees. At the same time, they are having the chance also to develop other activities. So also, for instance, we have undertaken programs in order to substitute the old household appliances that are that use
energy consumption.
Yes, are very intensive in energy consumption, by providing to the poor people some special credits, very in very favorable conditions, and also for taking their old appliances and giving them some money for their old appliances.
What do you think of Indonesia's role? I mean, we produced the Bali roadmap, which was very well received. So how else could Indonesia play its role in the international negotiation?
Well, I think Indonesia is playing really a major role because by making such important commitments that are being assumed even without international support, and even talking about more ambitious commitments in case there is international support provided. I think Indonesia is setting an example to many countries in the developing world, and making clear that fighting climate change does not necessarily mean that you will give up your expectations of growth and development, and that actually it is also one way of providing a better condition to your people.
Indonesia is already a significant emitter of greenhouse gases due to deforestation and land use change, estimated at 2 million hectares and accounting for 85% of the country's annual greenhouse gas emissions. The country is also a serious coal producer and user in the region. Now, the question is, what is Indonesia doing to take up the challenge of climate change? To know what Indonesia is doing to tackle climate change, to put climate adaptation into the development agenda, to promote sustainable land use as well as demand support from industrialized nations, I asked former Minister for Environment and Indonesia's climate change expert Rahmat Witular what Indonesia is bringing to the table in Cancun. What is Indonesia doing to support COP16 in Mexico, and what exactly are we bringing to the table?
Well, I think one of the first things that we do is try to have them the benefit of our experience. And for that purpose, the president of COP16 has been here and talking to us, to me. And she was asking actually the same question. What we want to bring to the COP16 is a better atmosphere, unlike we have in Copenhagen. Yeah. Because it's mostly the atmosphere. Because the concern of other countries are there, witnessing the 110 heads of states who came there, so they are very serious about it. But the atmosphere is not very conducive to making decisions like that.
Also, it was very cold in Copenhagen, so maybe Mexico would be better. But in terms of the concrete things, what are we bringing to the table?